Hello, everybody, and welcome to this final panel event of today with the CPS think tank on welfare after the pandemic. We have got more panel events tomorrow, so please do follow us on Twitter at CPS think tank and subscribe to our newsletter as well. You can go to our website, cps.org.uk. We've got a great panel for you today. Just to introduce our speakers, we've got Baroness Stroud, Philippa Stroud, the CEO of the Legatum Institute think tank, a former advisor to Ian Duncan Smith when he was at the Department for Work and Pensions, and to David Cameron, and a co-founder of the Centre for Social Justice. We have Helen Barnard, who is the director of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and has extensive experience working on poverty in the UK and on the UK welfare system. We've got Ed Davies, the policy director of the Centre for Social think tank. Before I head over to our panel for some opening remarks, I'm just going to sort of set the scene as I think it is in terms of the welfare agenda right now. I think the first thing to say is that actually the DWP has done surprisingly well on the whole, considering the substantial increase in volumes of work that it's been getting in terms of caseload. There were a couple of stories sort of March, April time of, people phoning up and things and not being able to get through. But on the whole, I think most of us have been surprised that things have gone reasonably well, and it's quite reassuring. I think there's a question as to how things are going to go when we presumably get the spike in claims as unemployment rises again, once furlough ends and so on, which we're all unfortunately expecting. And I think it will be really interesting to see how they respond, not just in terms of their systems, but in terms of capacity, because of course DWP capacity, partly because unemployment's been so low, has actually been pared down a bit. And we all know how important the support that DWP and Job Centre Plus provide can be. I don't know if anybody's been watching the Yorkshire Job Centre documentary on Channel 4 recently. It's actually been quite good, in my opinion, at sort of setting out how important that support can be for people to make sure that they bounce back quickly and get back into work if they've lost jobs, or if they've not worked for a long time, trying to get them into the labour market again. And obviously, particularly for young people coming into the labour market who haven't got the experience and so on, there's a real risk of that kind of lost generation. And there's lots of evidence that it can have a real long-term impact on people's lives if they don't manage to get jobs when they come out of university or when they come out of school and so on. I think there's also some interesting questions about whether some further emergency measures are going to be needed. Obviously, we've already had some in terms of increasing universal credit and so on, but for example, the CPS published a paper that I co-authored this week, which we partnered with the JRF on, in fact, on the support for mortgage interest scheme and what's going to happen to people as they maybe lose their jobs and their mortgage holidays come to an end. And there's also the question of whether some of the measures that have been introduced might become permanent. I know that the JRF have started campaigning for the increase in the universal credit level to be retained. There's obviously going to be some fiscal implications for that and so on. I think also, we sort of look at what types of support the DWP offers. Obviously, they tend to be very face-to-face, and that can be very important. How is the pandemic going to have a long-term impact on the way the DWP supports people, the way that people do assessments for benefits and that sort of thing? And is it also going to have an impact on the world of work, and how does that affect things like, for example, will disabled people be finding it easier to get into work because actually you can work remotely than for people who have mobility issues, for example? That might actually work very well. But then again, when for those of us who work in the welfare sector, the thinking about the benefits of work, a lot of it is to do with, the mental and physical benefits of work and so on, and social benefits of going and meeting people and so on. And do you get those sorts of same benefits from the world of work if you're just working from home all the time. So I think there's some interesting questions to be sort of played with around there, and answers that we probably won't know for sure for a long time. And then I think finally, just sort of, obviously there's going to be a lot of other stuff on the government's agenda, and I think, it will be interesting to hear what people think about what the priorities are going to be sort of long term for the welfare system. How, for example, has COVID impacted on public attitudes to it? There may be lots of people who have never had any contact with the welfare system before who suddenly find themselves out of work, and may be surprised, for example, at how little they get, even if they've been working for 20, 30 years. What sort of impact will that have on people's views? Similarly, we've gone through a period of very high employment. When we go through a period when lots of people are suddenly losing their jobs, largely not because of anything to do with them, but to do with things beyond their control, will that have an impact on people's attitudes to people who are unemployed, and by extension, people's attitude to the welfare system? And what sort of impact will that have on the government's policy agenda? So that's, I think, my sort of framing of the questions that we've got to sort of be thinking about and answering. And I think with that, I will hand over to Baroness Stroud for her opening remarks.
James, thank you so much, and thank you to the CPS for hosting this conversation as well. And it's a privilege for me to be on this, particularly with Ed from the CSJ and with Helen from JRF, both of whom I love working with. So it's a great conversation, so thank you. My first comment that I would like to say, I think probably chimes with a little of what you have just said, James, in the fact that I think the overwhelming sense of the DWP's performance at this time, and of Universal Credit's performance at this time, was one of huge relief, and well done to them. I mean, they have increased their caseload by 3 million and taken it to a total of 5.6 million, not gradually and smoothly, but under rapid fire. And it has shown that the system that people had little confidence in has not only stood up to it, but actually has fared really well. So if you think what would have been happening if families had to go and apply for housing benefits separately, had to go and apply for all these different benefits in person separately, what that would have been like in comparison to being able to apply online and get their benefits. So I think, I would just like to start really by saying a huge well done to the DWP. I'd also just like to say that probably for the first time in a very, very long time, there is a better understanding of the welfare state and of universal credit as a result of this pandemic, and also a greater sense of everybody owning it. The welfare state in its essence was started after World War II, when everybody had been through this experience together, and they wanted a system that in a way protected everyone together. And we're kind of going through a similar time at the moment where we're all in this together, and there's a sense of we want a system out there that really does support and care for people. So I have great hope that we'll come through this well. We do need to keep the £20, extra £20, I've just thrown that in there. But I do also think that it has revealed the difference between a poverty protection programme, which is what in effect universal credit is, and an income protection programme. And I think lots of people who have woken up at this in this time thinking that they have been paying into this system, and actually found that they're not protected at this moment. And I think there's just as with pensions, for example, we don't expect everyone to live on pension credit. People are paid into their pensions. I think we're going to have a conversation about income protection going forward, maybe something for the discussion as we go on. The third item is it's impacting the most vulnerable. This virus is impacting the most vulnerable, not just those on the poverty line, but those who've been impacted the most are those 50% below the poverty line in deep poverty, where 65% of those who are in deep poverty, who were employed, have either lost their jobs, been furloughed, or lost hours. Very, very significant impact on the most vulnerable. And then just in my last couple of minutes, I just want to say too that I think this pandemic has shown us what can be done. I think when we look at rough sleeping as an issue, which had been a growing feature on our streets, and one that most of us were really uncomfortable with, and lots of little things had been tried, suddenly, in a moment, with the will of government behind us all, we were able to see real resolution of rough sleeping, not permanently, but we were able to do something significant. I think that should challenge us about some of our other social problems. We need to focus on rough sleeping, but secondly, what should we be giving that level of focus to really see resolved, ended, and done away with? So those are just a few comments, and sure loads of other things will come out during the conversation.
Wonderful, thank you. Helen?
Yes, great. Thank you very much. It is brilliant to be here. So I think, like Philippa, one of the things that has struck me most positively through the pandemic has been the way that our shared national values have really shone through. And in particular, the commitment that we have to taking care of each other is something I think we've seen in communities all over the country. But I think that we've also seen a much greater realisation that social security, like our other public services, is one of the ways that we actually live those values. It's one of the ways we take care of each other. And I think that kind of greater realisation of that is a really good basis to go on from, because we've seen millions of people who have been hit by this storm, and the only reason they're staying afloat is because we've got a strong, effective social security system. What we also saw, I think, incredibly positively was really early on, really quickly, we saw the government step in, recognise that they had this amazingly powerful tool through social security, and put in place really bold, compassionate measures, which have just been crucial when we've been talking to people on low incomes over the country. That lifeline of social security with the extra boost of the £20 has been, the difference between having to miss some meals and having to miss them really, really consistently, for instance. But I think the pandemic has also highlighted some of the problems we came in with, which need fixing. So one of the clearest ones at the beginning was just the very low level of support. As those millions of people rolled onto it, the realisation that it was too low to properly keep people afloat, I think, came very fast. And some of the design flaws, like the 5-week wait at the beginning, which puts people into more debt, is clearly, makes no sense, never made any sense. But if you look at it in the context of a pandemic, looks even more problematic. And I think it is worth remembering that even with the boost to universal credit, families with children in particular have been really struggling. So the research that we've been doing is suggesting that getting on for 2/3, 6 and 10 families on universal credit, so getting the extra support, they're still missing out on essentials like food or electricity. The majority are still getting into debt through this pandemic, which is going to have longer term implications. The majority are still from mental health suffering. So we've done an enormous amount to keep people afloat, but there is still potentially longer term damage being done to those families. And I think if we're thinking about what the stage of policy is and what we do post-COVID with welfare, there are two big lessons which I want us to learn, not just from this pandemic, but from previous recessions and recoveries. And the first is that we need to have a recovery that remodels some of the other big bits of our society. So we need to remodel the labour market so work is a more reliable route out of poverty. We need to remodel the housing market so people can find a decent, affordable home. If we don't do those things, what I think we'll end up with is another decade in which social security has to pick up the pieces for the fact that those markets aren't functioning in the way they should be. And that puts pressure on the system, it makes it more expensive, it takes it away from its core functions. And I think the second thing we need to really hold on to is that social security is the lifeline when times are tough. We've all seen that in the pandemic, but actually in people's lives, people get ill, they lose their jobs, families break up. You need a lifeline to keep you steady through that. And you need that lifeline to let you take opportunities. So obviously, immediately I want us to keep hold of the extra £20, but actually more than that, I want us to keep hold of that sense of social security as one of the core planks with which we take care of each other, with which we create a stronger, more resilient society than we came into the pandemic with. Thanks very much.
Wonderful, thank you. And finally, Ed.
Hi there. Yeah, I suppose the danger of going after two experts like this is you're going to hear a fair bit of repetition, but hopefully there's some wheat amid the chaff here. I suppose there are sort of 3 points I would make. Firstly, how it's coped. Secondly, what that means going forward. And then thirdly, the big picture on welfare. In terms of how it's coped, exactly as others have said, I think huge credit to DWP. Not just for what they've done in the 6 months, redeploying staff, making small changes, but I think they have spent years being really under the cosh for universal credit. And they've just sort of said, bear with us. We know there are problems. We know it's not perfect, but we think this is the right thing. And then at this point where the stuff has hit the fan, as Philippa said, 3 million people coming on, not just over a time, but overnight. 10 years ago, this would have been people snaking around every town and city in the country trying to sign on for various benefits. And actually, the change that has happened in that 10 years is huge. So massive credit to DWP. And I suppose that leads to the second point in terms of what needs reforming in the immediate. And I think the lesson to learn is not too much. Don't just dive in and say we need to reform everything. Because actually, when things got really serious, it worked and it held up. And so to actually have some faith in the guys in the DWP who said, bear with us, this is important. Because amazingly, they know what they're doing. That said, there are a few things that I think we need to be aware of in the next 6 months or a year, because the environment will be very different. And I think one of those, sort of around conditionality, you've got a situation where it's a really important principle to keep there. But up until 6 months ago, you had really high employment and you had a lot of vacancies. That may look very different in a year's time. And so asking someone, I don't know, young person coming out of school in Merthyr Tydfil with very low qualifications, no experience and very few jobs, saying you must job hunt for 30 hours, might be like banging your head against a brick wall. So just to have that conversation of, is there a sort of a way we can expand the provision for volunteering that might get a young person some experience, that might lead to a job, that sort of thing. Do we need to think about the rates for self-employed people, for people starting businesses? That just those small changes that in a different environment, so we can think about, does this need to adapt a bit to what's going on in the outside world? But again, not too much, because I think what we've shown is that you don't need to make huge changes. And then the last thing is the big picture. And I think the reality that we're seeing is a lot of people who are becoming unemployed now are still work ready, and they may find a job quite soon. But the problems we've seen over the last few years, and that we will see in the years going ahead, is there is a cohort who are just nowhere near the world of work right now. Their lives are complex and messy, and they have deep, difficult problems to deal with. I think I'm always staggered. There are 5 million adults in the UK who have low literacy and numeracy. That means 5 million adults who can't read an aspirin packet or understand the fuel gauge on a car. And no amount of improving a system by bits and bobs will teach them to read. We've got 500,000 people with gambling problems at the moment, and that's probably skyrocketed during lockdown as well. Actually, we need to really focus on what that person needs, and it probably is going to be a lot more difficult and a lot more involved than simply changing bits and bobs around universal credit. What are those interventions? And I know when it was rolled out, we talked quite a lot about this thing called universal support at the CSJ. And when universal credit was rolled out, it was supposed to have this thing called universal support. There have been sort of small attempts at it over the years. There's been universal support delivered locally trials. Recently, you've had the help to claim by the Citizens Advice Bureau. These have been a sort of a 5% of what universal support could be. But what it really needs to become, and what we see in our work, is it needs to be a personalised, really tailored approach for people who aren't just ready for work and won't just find a job, that have deep complex issues. They have a personal person that takes them through and says, right, this person doesn't just need to get online and make their claim. They need addiction treatment. They need help with their debt problem. They need relationship help. They're in an abusive relationship. What are all the things that person needs? And I think the problem we're going to see going forward is that with 3 million people who are out of work but work ready, the low-hanging fruit will be to get them back into work. But there is still this cohort who have not been working for years, who are horribly scarred by that, and who are often forgotten by the welfare system. And a computer program alone won't fix that. They need a person to hold them through that process and get them back into work again. So I suppose I'll leave it at that, but there's a lot to go with there.
There is a lot to go with there, and thank you all very much. And that's opened up the discussion nicely. Just to say that apparently our Slido system for submitting questions is not working. So if people do have questions, you can still submit them to us on Twitter at CPS Think Tank, or you can send them to us via email on events@cps.org.uk, and we will try to put them to the panelists. I think to sort of start the discussion off, since we talked so much about universal credit in there, I'd be interested to hear sort of what people's thoughts are on whether, since there seems to be general agreement that actually the system worked reasonably well, considering the shock that it undertook. Do we think that this could almost be the sort of the moment at which universal credit is finally kind of, accepted, as it were, that it might actually end up being that because universal credit has a good crisis, we finally move on from talking about days and so on, and is universal credit essentially going to stop being the story, because it has really been the story on welfare for the last 8 years or so, at least. Do we think that essentially the story's done on universal credit now? Is it just roll out, and it's, as Ed sort of said, we don't really need to keep tinkering with it? What do people sort of think about that?
Do you want me to kick it off?
Go on, you kick off, Philippa.
Yeah, so I would agree. I mean, my frustration for a while has been that I felt quite a lot of the attacks have been much more political in nature, and that we've got used to knocking this political football around called universal credit. At the beginning of universal credit's life, it had the one great merit that there was cross-party support for it. And I think that because of the welfare cuts that came, that cross-party support peeled away. But actually, a lot of those welfare cuts were in the legacy systems and the legacy benefits, which were then all rolled into universal credit. So universal credit in and of itself is just an earnings disregard and a taper rate, or work allowance and a taper rate. I mean, it's very, very simple mechanism. But all these other things got heaped in, and then there was this kind of pile of anger directed towards this thing called universal credit. I would hope now that people can see the benefits of it, and gradually over the last few spending reviews and budgets, some of that investment has been gradually going back in. Things like the freeze has stopped. Things like there was Philip Hammond put £1 billion back into it as well, and so gradually that original investment has gone back in. And I do think that's one of the reasons why I think this the £20 should be kept, because it begins to take universal credit pretty much back to where it was to begin with, which I think is really important. So yes, hopefully a slightly more focused water spirit.
Okay. Well, I think that the bit I agree with definitely is that for the last few years, universal credit has become a label for everything people don't like about the benefit system. They kind of say, well, we need to ditch universal credit. Whereas actually, if you look at actually at its core, it is clearly a good idea. That's why it got massive support when it first came out. I think that there are kind of three buckets of stuff which do need to be fixed, only one of which actually has anything to do with universal credit. So one bucket is just how much you get. And as Philippa said, the fact that it came in at the same time as massive cuts really kind of gutted it, because it meant that from being something that would net benefit people, it became something for a while that would net disbenefit people. And even now, when it's tipped back, so just about more people gain than lose, you've still got several million people who were already in poverty, who by moving over lose really significant amounts of money, kind of £2,000 a year type money. So one thing is just the amount of money in the system and who it gets to. And that, it doesn't really matter which system you're on. You just need to make sure people get what they need. The second bucket of stuff is other things that came in at the same time and could be kind of fixed without touching it. So the benefit cap, which during the pandemic is a bizarre thing, meant that some people who were meant to get the extra £20 not only haven't got it, but a few of them have actually ended up poorer during the pandemic because of the functioning of that cap, which was never the policy intent. I think that there is a third stuff, which is about the way universal credit was built, which does need fixing, which didn't have to be there from the concept. But so the most obvious things, the 5-week wait at the beginning before you get your first money. So basically your choice is you get into debt with an advance, in which case you'll be poorer later, or you get by with no money. There's nothing in the concept of UC that says it have to be there, but there has been incredible resistance to doing anything about it. And the other thing is the very rigid monthly payment system, which is creating these bizarre situations for people where they find that what it does is exaggerate income volatility rather than smoothing it, which is what you'd want. So most people in work on low incomes don't get paid regularly every month on the same date. Most people get paid every now and then, or every week, or every 2 weeks, or whatever it is. And UC was built as if most people would be in that regular monthly cycle. And that has led to, unintended but appalling consequences for some people, which have made it very hard to live. So I think that all those stuff do need fixing, but I share the hope that we can stop having this kind of straw man debate about whether you need a new system and actually get on with fixing the one we have.
Can I throw in one other thing as well? There's a really practical PR issue in that this is rolling out over a long period. And the idea is you roll it out a bit, you test it, you see what needs improving, you roll out a bit more. And so over the course of years, you have a new area every few weeks coming online, new people trying it. And every single problem is then put on the front page of a newspaper and blown up as this huge universal credit problem. If you think back to the introduction of tax credits, where it went so haywire, Tony Blair had to get up in front of Parliament and apologise. And one of the biggest issues you've still got in universal credit is the repayment of money from that mistake that was so long ago, which is causing huge problems. But because it happened overnight, it was one apology, it was gone. And actually the number of people affected was probably far worse, but you've got this almost PR problem that the slow rollout and the testing as you go means that almost every month there is another story of somewhere it is rolled out. And there is one of these cases that I talked about earlier of somebody in a horribly complex, difficult situation that you can put on the front page and say, look, this is what universal credit has done. And I think just in terms of learning going forward, I genuinely don't know which is better, because the amount of fear that is put around by newspapers, I mean, people are terrified of universal credit. We hear of people who won't go to job centres and things because they're so frightened of it. It seems to be that the slow rollout is better, but the PR is so bad from doing it that way that maybe it's not. Maybe actually other countries in future who are doing this, maybe they need to say, we'll just take what happens on the day it rolls out, we'll throw money at it, we'll do something, because we can't live with the kind of negative PR that this has had. So sort of a question there, which is quite open. I don't know the best way to do it. I think this is better for claimants, how it's going, but PR-wise, it's not been great.
I think it is better for claimants, but the trouble is test and learn only works if you actually learn. The problem with universal credit and the way it's happened is it's about but actually the power of the people within the system to make changes has been so little that you get this kind of stream of negative stories. And I agree that it gets a bad. I also think that, to be honest, is fair, because when you talk to people, quite a lot of time they are people they know who had bad experiences. This isn't just a kind of manufactured thing. And things like you said, the idea that you crystallise your tax credit debt and suddenly you make a claim and you're paying back thousands of pounds from 10 years ago. Most of these things were predicted and could have been fixed before they happened, or at the very least could have been acknowledged quickly and a fix put in place. I think one of the problems has been the resistance to making changes then, creates this feeling that it's this kind of rigid behemoth that can't be fixed. Whereas one of the things I think Amber Rudd was quite interesting, one of the reasons I think she got a very different reaction is because she was much more open about saying, I found this problem, I really want to fix it. And that creates a very different conversation. but that's not what we've had a lot of the time. There's just been this kind of put up the walls defensiveness. And if you do that, people stop giving it the kind of goodwill credit that we would have had if they were actually acting on things when they came up.
I think it's really interesting, actually, the sort of that on the one hand, the universal credit rollout, as Ed said, the intention was caution and learning and adapting, but then, as Helen said, it's actually been really difficult to adapt to the system. And I know, meeting people from the DUP and talking to them, and I'm sure Philippa will know a lot about the sort of way that the system was set up, that is an incredibly universal credit at its heart is an IT system, and the problem with things like the monthly payment structure to it and that sort of thing is that once it's sort of baked in, it's actually incredibly difficult to unpick those technical aspects of the system when you realise that they're causing a lot of problems. We had a question from on Twitter about the debt issue that just came up, which seems sort of relevant. That is there a sort of if the future of welfare is these massive IT systems, is there an easy way to make sure that these actually really troubling specific human cases of people who, for example, through no fault of their own, end up having huge debts because of something that's gone wrong with their welfare payments? I'd probably be particularly interested to hear what Philippa sort of thinks about what's the sort of governmental way of making sure you minimise those sorts of problems, because ultimately, you just put out a contract for a massive IT system, right? And how do you make sure that you're not going to end up with these tragedies, essentially?
Thank you, James. I mean, I think there are two different issues there. One is the debt issue. The other is, flexibility to change and to learning. And then how do you marry up a huge IT system with people and vulnerable people? So the debt issue, I don't know a Secretary of State, and there have been numbers of them over the last few years of DWP, who hasn't actually said this big issue of tax credit debt that claimants don't even know about because they left the system and are now coming back into universal credit. Suddenly they're being hit with this huge number that was a clawback from the tax credit system that isn't calling for debt amnesty. I know IDS is in that place. We've given evidence to both the Work and Pension Select Committee and the Lord Select Committee on this, and just saying government has to take some responsibility here for the fact that this was not done in real time with these families. So I think that's one comment I would make. On the inflexibilities, I would also say that as the system becomes more resilient, more stable, everyone has more confidence in it, I think it will be the time to turn to some of these things. And again, we've long advocated that it should be possible that if you're paid weekly, you get your universal credit weekly. If you're paid fortnightly, you get it fortnightly. If you're paid monthly, you get it monthly. Just to say though, that sounds so simple, but there are 30 or 31 days in a month, and there are 7 days in a week and 14 days in a fortnight. And therefore the cost, there is a big cost of moving from weekly, fortnightly to monthly. I know that sounds crazy, but we had it costed out at over £1 billion. So there has to be something that people are prepared to put money behind. And then the third issue was, this huge IT system and then vulnerable people. And this is where Ed's point of universal support comes in. There has to be a place where a big IT system and a vulnerable person is cared for by a person in real time, in the real place, where somebody gets alongside them and works with them and supports them through, so that people don't get hurt in the process. I think those have been my comments on that. Yeah.
I think the other thing that we sort of haven't mentioned so much about universal credit, that was talked about a lot as a sort of justification for the system, is that the good thing about it is both an out of work and in work benefit. And so people who may have already been, for example, on a low income and were already claiming and then lost work, there'll be a lot less of a sort of shock to the system in that sense, because it's much easier to adjust. But obviously, part of that focus for the DWP in recent years, because employment has been so strong, the focus has been on using universal credit for in-work support, and helping people to increase their hours and earnings and so on, and sort of moving away from the focus on just getting lots of people into work, which was what was sort of being mainly focused on when obviously the Conservatives came in 2010, and unemployment. Do people think? I mean, is there a sort of clear binary there between the sort of, on the one hand, helping people into work, and that's what the department's all about, and then on the other hand, we shift the focus? I mean, I know when my previous job, I used to sit in ministerial meetings and work ministerial team and so on, and there was a lot of chat about, you know, things like the taper rate and work allowances and so on. The taper rate was a thing that was to look at because they wanted to be encouraging people to increase their earnings who were already in work. Now that we're going to see, from what we all expect, much more people who are just out of work, how does the department manage that sort of shift in focus, if you see what I mean?
So I think it's probably two things. So I spent under the old system years complaining about the fact that Job Centre Plus had all their targets on just moving people into a job, into any job, and that led to perverse outcomes, because what it led to was loads of people going into low-paid, poor-quality jobs that weren't going to get them anywhere, and where they weren't going to get any training. And I remember saying again and again, we need to create incentives within the system to get people into the kind of work that lets them work the way up, so that they can, just support their families. That you aren't stuck in a job that's low hours and poor quality. So I feel very strongly that we do want a system which is unified, where you don't have to keep switching benefits every time you go in and out of work. And we want a system where the people within it are incentivized to get people into quality work, not just any job. And I think that is as relevant when you're in a situation of high unemployment, because what you should be doing is looking to make sure that people can take up training, that people can reskill, that you have a system where locally you are creating a pipeline of people into good quality jobs locally, so that you don't let where there's just a cycle in and out of not very good work. So I think it is a challenge, and it's a challenge mainly, as you said at the beginning, about capacity. Do we have enough people to give that support, and enough people to give the specialist support to, for instance, disabled workers with low qualifications, who are going to be the first to lose work and the last to get back in? But I think the goal of the system is right and should remain, which is to get people into good quality work, which frees them from poverty.
Can I just comment on that as well?
Yeah,
just to say that when universal credit was created, it was on the back of the financial crisis. So the work we were doing on it at the CSJ was 2007, 8, 9, and then we brought it into government in 2010. And at that point, there were nearly 3 million people unemployed. Unemployment was at 8%. At the moment, we are at around 4.1% unemployment, and that's even with the recent big claims for universal credit. And it's just worth bearing that in mind. And this current financial situation is a man-made one. We have suppressed the economy. So if we remove some of that suppression, the circumstances are there for the jobs to come back, and human drive and ingenuity is strong and wanting to do that, and there are a lot of people who are desperate to work, which leads me to believe that there would be a drive back. So I just think we should be aware that it's only a few years ago that we were at 8%, and at that time people were saying you can't have a work expectation on people because the jobs aren't out there. As we put a work expectation on people and created an environment where it paid to work, people realised they were better off in work than not in work. And they either created the jobs themselves through self-employment or through starting their own companies, or actually other employers started realising they could create jobs for low-income people as well. So it's just a really, really interesting, that we are nowhere near as bad a situation as we were in 2010 when the coalition government first came in.
Absolutely. I'll sort of turn into some of the questions that we've got coming in. Question saying, will the fact that many more people are being exposed to the welfare system because of Corona change our attitude to it, which is something we sort of touched on in opening remarks. What do people think? Do you think that there'll be a sort of long-term shift in people's attitudes to the system? And will that be a result of simply more people coming into contact with it, or will it be sort of more sort of broad, more cultural than that?
One of the things I've noticed just over the last few weeks is how some of the conversations around it have changed. So I've seen several people talking about the £16,000 savings cap before you can, above which you can't claim universal credit. And as more people come out of quite high paid work, because as Philippa said, the suppression on the economy, suddenly sort of things that we never really talked about before because they weren't really an issue are just sort of becoming part of the conversation around this. And I suppose what that says is the people who are now coming into being unemployed are quite a different clientele. And there's an interesting article in The Guardian this week that just talked about an airline pilot and how he was finding universal credit. You don't get many airline pilots on universal credit. But I suppose that the flip side of that is the thing I mentioned earlier. I basically think if you're an airline pilot, you're going to get a job eventually. You really are. You've got the training, you've got the skills, you're going to be fine. And it feels hard. I've been made redundant twice in my life, and it feels really hard that moment you get made redundant. But I think if you've got the education and you've got the skills and support around you, do you know what? You'll probably get a job again one day. You will find a way through this. Whereas the danger, again, as I mentioned earlier, is this group who are totally isolated, who actually are still there and have been there for years, some of them, years and years, decades, generations, who've been sitting there, and no one's really grappled with the thing that's keeping them there. And then they're going to get lost in this. The new people come on and they're talking about their £16,000 that they're saving for their mortgage. And suddenly we're not looking at this bottom end again. And I think, the Trussell Trust report, The State of Hunger, came out about a year ago. It was fascinating looking at the demographics on this. Again, you had about a third people were on universal credit. I think it was about 36, 37%. And you instinctively think it was everyone, but it wasn't. But what you also saw was almost half the people going to Trussell Trust food banks live completely alone. They have no one around them at all. And it's about 10% of the general population, but about half the people in food banks. And the thing is, we're going to start forgetting about people like that because we're talking about airline pilots' savings. And so that's the real risk here, I think, is that people they are going to be okay. This is hard, there is no doubt. There's nothing worse than not having a reason to get up in the morning, but they will be okay. And we're going to forget there is this group who have no one, who turn up in our food banks because they have no food, they have no one to support them. What are we doing down there? And I think that's what we mustn't forget in the talk of people coming in out of work and the change.
I think what is interesting is that all the new people coming onto the system, they are experiencing a much version of the system than many of the people pre-pandemic experienced. Because the people coming in now are experiencing a system where the basic amount of support that's available is higher, where housing benefit, if you're in the private rented sector, actually has something to do with the rent you're paying. There have been quite of lifting of some of the sanctions, the conditionality, some of the things that people find it hardest to live with. And I think there's been interesting. I think there has been more focus on wanting to have a system where people feel treated with respect and dignity, perhaps partly because the people coming onto it are more vocal, are different to the people who would have been on it a year ago. I think my hope is that what that will create is a much bigger group of people in society with an understanding of how important it is to have a system that deals with people as people, that empowers and respects people, and that will hold on to some of those less tangible things, I think, as well as things like a higher level of support, because lots of people found once you get on it, it turns out you can't really buy food and keep your house heated. So I think we need to try and hold on to some of that, and hopefully there is a greater cohort of people who will get personally why those things are important.
I did a radio show this week on you and yours, and the chap who was being interviewed alongside me had just lost his whole business. He had been had a production company for the arts, and it had had £1 million turnover, and he had taken out about 50k, and he had £1,000 a month mortgage. And his argument was, I thought that at a moment like this, given all that I've paid in taxes for my business, taxes on my income, I've been a faithful taxpayer, I thought there would be more for me at this moment in time. And I think that some of the people who have come onto universal credit haven't really realised what the welfare state is, that it is in effect that safety net, but it isn't much more than a safety net. And this is where I kind of, in my opening remarks, I just hinted at the fact that just as we created auto-enrolment for pension schemes so that people had a pension in the future that enabled them to carry on their standard of living into retirement, so I think we're going to need to have a conversation around what does it mean for people whose day-to-day incomes are significantly greater than those that a welfare state can provide for. How are they going to protect their income if there was another pandemic or a crisis again? So income protection, I think, needs to be much more of a national conversation for people who are very unlikely to come near the welfare state but at any other moment other than a real moment of national or international crisis.
Yeah, I think that's actually very interesting, and we have had a question in that sort of leads on from that about the contributory side of the welfare system and whether we need a more contributory welfare system. It's something that I think the Labour Party have actually talked about a few months back, saying that they wanted to see more of a contributory element to the system. Obviously, a lot of other countries do have systems that are more contributory, and in turn, they have more of a sort of safety net. If you move out of work in a lot of European countries, you'll get % of your previous wage paid to you. So, I mean, is the answer to what Philippa was talking about, to sort of look at the contributory side of things and a more contributory welfare system? Because of course the problem with that is, on the flip side of it, it would tend to, either it's going to be extremely expensive, or you end up focusing money on people who don't necessarily need it compared to some of the more needy in society, unless you're just going to massively increase people's payments, which isn't necessarily popular. So what's the sort of, how do you sort of get around those competing issues?
Yeah, I remember that we looked at this a few years ago. We did a bit of work with WPI, I think it was, either WPI or SMF, and thinking about that. So the issue, I think you've pinpointed the issue, which is how do you have a system which protects people from poverty, which I think should be its kind of first duty in a civilized society, and in a situation where there are quite large numbers of people who are stuck in a bit of the labour market, which mean that they are always struggling to stay afloat. Because I think that's the other interaction with it. the fact there are so many people stuck in this poor quality bit of the labour market who will therefore never really have the option to build up a serious amount of personal savings, and would probably therefore also struggle to build up a massive amount of contributory. And I think we ended up in a place of kind of thinking we need the core system to be fully funded, so that rather than protecting people from poverty, but potentially should we, which is a kind of top up which you can pay into, and there would be things like could you build up a fund you can use for retraining if you decide you want to switch sector? Could you build up a pot which could be used flexibly to kind of help you shift direction or to tide you over in a if something kind of hits you unexpectedly? But I suppose for me there is the to start with a system that works in terms of protecting people from destitution, and I wouldn't want to see that diluted to fix this other issue, which I agree is an issue, but I think it need to be kept in two buckets.
I think there's a sort of, I can see the argument for it, but there is a sort of slight small state conservative in me as well that says, do you know what, this already exists. You know, I took out a huge mortgage when I had a wife and 2 kids and a job that was slightly precarious in journalism, and I took out employment insurance at the same time, which is effectively what we're talking about. And that system does exist, and I'm not sure necessarily that the state can better replicate that, or necessarily that it should. I think this safety net that we have is right. It's right that we are protecting people from falling into poverty. If we want to protect incomes, we kind of do that through the private sector quite well already. And I don't know that necessarily it's the job of the state to pick that up. And I think if they did, they might just do it worse.
Yeah, I don't think, I would agree with you, Ed. I don't think that it should be part of the welfare state, but I do think that it should be part of a national conversation so that people clearly understand that the function of the welfare state and what it is there for, who it is providing for, so that people actually think like you thought to take out employment insurance. And that the auto-enrolment scheme works really well for pensions. Is that a model for some form of income protection? Just a question. Yeah, but I absolutely agree. I don't think it should be confused and put into the kind of welfare state as such.
I think the other thing, of course, I think, so why don't more people do this? Partly because we are, as humans, very, very bad at predicting the future or preparing for it, by and large. That's why we have a pension system, actually, because otherwise nobody would save for their pensions. But the other reason, I guess, is in normal times, many of the people who are currently struggling would get back into work so quickly that it actually they wouldn't need a system like the kind of mortgage thing. It's if you have a catastrophic, accident at work or something, isn't it? It's something life-changing. Whereas, as you said, an airline pilot, in normal circumstances, most people come out of work, they get back to work in weeks. They have savings. And so in a sense, maybe there isn't, in normal times, great enough demand from most people. And actually, that's why the system we've got has ended up focusing on people for whom they're unlikely to be able to get through those periods of time and are more likely to have longer times of need. So also, I suppose one of the questions is, post-pandemic, do we think people will really have changed, or do we just snap back into pre-pandemic assumptions? I suspect there will be more snapping back than many of us currently think once normal economic conditions kind of resume.
Also, just throw in the mix, really interesting, Philippa's comment there about having a national conversation about this. I think this is something I've been slightly ignorant of, actually, that there is a real culture issue here that is going on that actually we don't talk about half enough. We had a sort of planning day at the CSJ recently, and a couple of the younger researchers here were talking about a thing called Klarna, which I'd never heard of. And it's essentially when you check out of buying something, it could be just an item of clothing or something like that. You effectively pay for it over a few weeks. And if you miss it over a few weeks, you can put it on debt. And it's absolutely everywhere. I'd never heard of it until they mentioned it. And now I see it everywhere. And you have these things like that, just little cultural things that say, don't save for this, put it on credit. And they're just in everything we do. Everything we do day on day is build up the debt, don't save. Those little messages in the sort of the public narrative of how this builds up. And so that actually we reach a point where people aren't saving for their pensions. They're not saving when they can. They're not building up insurance or anything like that. They're just hoping they're getting okay, and then they're putting on the credit card. And that actually runs really deep in culture, and it's sort of pushed by the way we do business. And I think it is really important that we start recognizing that and saying, do you know what, actually, if you can't buy this item of clothing straight out, probably don't buy it. If you don't need it, don't put it on layaway for the next 3 weeks. If you don't need it, don't buy it. And be a bit more honest about that, because I think it's just slipping into a culture in a really damaging way.
Yeah, fantastic. Final question, I think this will probably be the final question, is from Neil, who asks, is the support given to the young workforce the same as the type given to the over 35s? Value lifelong learning and working in COVID. I think it would be interesting just to hear in general what people think about the impact that the pandemic is going to have on young people in particular, on their lives, on their future employment prospects, the impact it's having on people's education. There's been a lot of stuff in the news about what's happening to students and so on. And obviously in particular there's been, for example, the Kickstart scheme has been set up for young people, which is a sort of similar scheme to the Future Jobs Fund that the Labour Party implemented in the last recession. And it's interesting to hear people think that sort of intervention is going to be effective in terms of effectively subsidising employers to give people work experience and so on. Is that the kind of thing that we need to be seeing to make sure that we don't have kind of lost generation that I talked about at the beginning?
Can I, on this one, so I mentioned that we did a policy planning day at the CSJ. We've had 3 days of going through what we think the big issues are going forward. And the first of the day, we sent every single member of the organisation out to meet a small charity or two and say, what are your big issues? And the thing that came back from almost every charity was saying 6 months from now, youth employment is going to be a massive, massive problem. And I think you're absolutely right to highlight this, because it's what we're hearing time and time again at the moment. In terms of answers to that, I was really pleased last week that one of the few non-COVID Brexit conversations that Boris Johnson has involved himself in was lifelong learning and apprenticeships. I think that's going to be hugely, hugely important to this. And certainly all the charities coming to us saying, what can I do with these kids? What can they do? Where are they going to get training? Where are they going to get experience? And so just making sure that this is absolutely front and centre of the conversation for the next 12 months, I think is going to be really, really important.
Any other brief comments from?
I think just from a political perspective, we need to understand what these young people have just been through as well. If you think about their exam experience, where they felt as though they were a cog in a wheel with no one knowing them and out of control of even the verdict on their own performance, then you've got a generation who've gone up to university, where what they could have done from home, or at least had the choice whether or not to go and do it from home or from the university. And the danger is that we produce a generation who don't have confidence in central government or in governance, and therefore they don't understand how their place in society, and they feel quite connected. And we really owe it to this generation to see them through really, really well, and to do everything we can to enable them to succeed, get jobs, and to thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is all we've got time for. Unfortunately, sorry to Helen if she wanted to come in that one. Discussion. I think we covered a lot of ground. I'm quite impressed. Thank you very much to Strauss, to Ed Davies, and to Helen Barnard. We have 2 more events tomorrow as guests on this virtual conference, so please do look us up if you're interested. Thank you everybody for joining us, particularly to our guests. I've been James Hayward, Head of Welfare and Opportunity at the CPM, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you.